Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Alison Tyra, and today I'm joined by Sara Sheridan, author of several novels, including On Starlit Seas, which was shortlisted for the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize and was listed on the London Times Best Historical Fiction Reads of 2025. The book is about, as you call her, the brilliant Georgian travel writer, Mariah Graham. So, could you introduce us to Mariah and her work?
Yes, so Mariah she comes from a Scottish family. Her maiden name is Dundas, but she's actually born in Northern England. She comes from a family where her mother, I suspect, is probably American. We don't know a great deal about her mother. There's not a lot of documentary evidence about her, but her father is a naval officer in the British Navy, and he is away really for most of her childhood. He's an absent father, and Mariah is brought up by various Dundas relations and goes to school in Oxfordshire. And she later writes a kind of memoir, a kind of autobiography about this. And she had a really difficult time. She wasn't a kind of conformist person, really. And she got into lots of trouble at school for being what at the time would have perhaps been termed a blue stocking. She was a bit of a swot. She was a nerd. And this was something that, young ladies were not particularly brought up to be. And certainly in the early 1800s, in the late 1700s, that was okay. By the sort of early 1800s, being a blue stocking had fallen a little bit out of fashion. Anyway, when she's 23, she goes to India where her father is stationed, and she meets another naval officer, Thomas Graham, and they get married, and she becomes a naval officer's wife. And she writes, and her publisher is one of the very early publishers in London, John Murray. John Murray the First set up what was really one of the first publishing houses within the UK. So prior to that, if you wanted to write a book or get a book out there, you either published it yourself by contracting a printer, and you had editions made, and then you would distribute those editions among your friends, or through bookshops. And so basically, you had to be quite wealthy, or you could do what was kind of a modern crowdfunding sort of model, which was to publish by subscription. And so, for example, all of Robert Burns's poetry was published by subscription. People would give him money in advance for a copy of, his next book. And so John Murray changed this model. He was a Scottish guy, gone down to London, and he started publishing, not quite in the modern sense, but that he would commission people who come to him and say, I've either written a book, or he would go to people and say, I would like you to write a book. And he would deal with the printer, and he would deal with the distribution, and he would come to an arrangement. That there were a couple of different arrangements you could come to initially, but basically quite often on royalty, or a fee that was paid to the writer. And so Mariah earned a living by writing from really quite early on. She wrote non-fiction. Fiction was considered a little bit kind of fanciful or not really very serious, and she was a serious young woman. And she wrote a book about painting. She was very keen on art, and also started to write about places that she had travelled to. And this is sort of the era that the British Empire is expanding. And John Murray the second, John Murray's first son, is called John Murray the second. There are loads of John Murrays. We got up to John Murray 9 in the end. But John Murray the second is the Murray who is installed in London in kind of the family house in Albemarle Place in Piccadilly. And he runs a salon there, where he invites, all of intellectual London to come and exchange ideas and chat. And he becomes Mariah's publisher. He's also Jane Austen's publisher. He's Byron's publisher. He's really, really well connected. And he has this brilliant idea to start commissioning travel books. And these early travel books and travel guides are really for people going out places, in this burgeoning British Empire, to learn about what opportunities there are for trade, or what you might need to take with you. And some of the early ones are quite comical, really, because unlike today, if you are commissioned by the Rough Guide, or a large imprint of travel guides. They tell you what they want. They say, we want, so many words about the weather, and we want, this many pages about restaurants, and we want a description of the weather, and they tell you. But John Murray initially just let people write what they knew. And quite often, there might be only one or two people in London who'd actually been to, say, Burma or the interior of China for some of these early guides. And the Burmese one is really funny, because the guy who went out there had been brought up on a poultry farm, and he was really interested in poultry. And there's a big section in this early travel guide all about poultry in Burma, and what all the chickens are like and what they're fed, and how many eggs you might get in a day from a particular kind of chicken. Anyway, Mariah writes these books, and she writes them really well with an eye to what the economy's like, what the country produces, what the weather's like, what you might like to take with you. If you have to go there, what can you get hold of there, and what would you like to bring? Her work, it becomes really quite respected. And so she writes about India when she goes out with her father, when she goes out there to visit her father, and when she gets married. And then when Thomas Graham is commissioned on a naval ship, her husband, to go to South America, she goes with him. And she travels to Chile initially, and unfortunately he contracts, we're not quite sure what he contracts, some kind of disease, certainly a fever, and he dies. She nurses him, and he dies on board the ship just as it rounds the Cape Horn at the south of Chile, and she arrives in Valparaiso as a widow. And she's still very young. And there's a British community there, and they kind of rally round her. Everyone wants to look after her. But she's really quite fiercely independent, and she decides she doesn't want to be looked after. And she certainly doesn't want to be sent home to the UK. And she certainly doesn't want to live within what is really a British enclave there among people of her own. And this is a kind of recurring theme for Mariah during her life. She likes to go and experience the countries she visits as they really are, with the local people. She likes to understand the local customs. She doesn't want to be removed from that. So she stays in Chile, despite everybody's best efforts, for a year, writes a book about her year in Chile, and then moves to Brazil, and she goes to Rio, where she writes another book about her time in Rio, and also is offered a job by the Brazilian empress, the royal family there, to be the governess to the young princess, the heir of the throne, she's just a toddler, she's about 2 or 3 years of age at this point. But Mariah gets on very well with the empress, and they have a common interest in horticulture, in plants and botanicals. And she gets this fabulous job, and she is sent back to London to buy all the books that are required for this job, to sort of stock a library for this young princess to be taught from as she grows older. And she goes back to the UK, does that, delivers her books, and while she has been in Chile, she has observed some earthquakes. There have been a great deal of earthquakes, and she has realized that, I suppose today we measure earthquakes, of course, on the Richter scale. So what Mariah figures out is the mathematical formula for a kind of proto Richter scale, and she comes back to London with that as well, and really faces quite a bit of prejudice. She's not allowed to present her theory at the Royal Society in London. She faces some difficulties with some reviewers who don't like her books because she's a woman. They don't think she can possibly understand what she's writing about. Some booksellers refuse to stock her books because she's a woman writing non-fiction. But there are kind of a core of allies, I suppose, Georgian allies, John Murray among them. Charles Darwin, for example, becomes an ally of Mariah. One presumes that they perhaps met at John Murray's salon at Albemarle Street, and stands up for her theory as well about how to calculate the size of earthquakes and things. This is the point in her life which I found myself drawn to write about her in fiction. But she goes on to have a very illustrious career. She continues to write. She goes back to Brazil, stays there for a while during the War for Brazilian independence, and then ends up latterly coming back to Britain, and forges a second marriage with Augustus Colcott, who was a painter who has painted some beautiful images of her. And she continues to write with him. They travel within Europe, and then latterly, sadly, she becomes ill and she can't travel anymore. And she dies quite young, really. She dies in her late 50s.
anytime we're talking about a European travel writer going to non-predominantly white
Mhm.
countries, or even places like the US and Australia, which are now predominantly white, I'm always curious from a modern perspective, how racist was she? Maybe she wasn't, but that's always
That's a
my
great,
initial question is like, okay,
yeah.
just checking how racist are we talking? Because even the best of them, I feel like did have certain biases, but as you're talking about, she didn't want to be in an enclave of people with her same background. She wanted to be immersed in the cultures that she was visiting. So, where does she fall on that scale?
I mean, I've written novels before about people who have all the ists. They're racist, they're sexist, they're misogynist. I've dealt a lot with that material in her letters and in her journals, and also in her printed writing. She comes across as fairly left wing, really, for the day. Slavery is already outlawed in the UK from 1807, but within the British Empire, it's still ongoing until 1833. And then, of course, we move into indentured service. So she is traveling it within the period where there is still slavery, there's still widespread slavery within the British Empire. And in fact, on that trip coming back from Brazil to London, she stops in the Caribbean. And there is a passage in her journal about how she sees enslaved people being taken off this ship, and they're so happy that they've survived. They don't. She thinks that they maybe don't even realize that they're about to be sold, and she bursts into tears. She's really very empathetic about it, and really very against the whole kind of slavery industry. Um, but that said, um, I wouldn't like to say she absolutely wasn't somebody who had any racism or any expectations of that at all. I don't think she was a eugenicist. I don't think she was particularly right wing, but I think she had a sense of her entitlement to travel, shall we say, her entitlement to be there. And certainly the structures in which she was brought up and in which she initially married into was the British Navy. It was an engine of empire. So while I'm not sure I would say she was an out and out racist, and she certainly had empathy and was against the enslavement of people, and stood up and wrote about that and had an emotional response to that, I would say she was an imperialist. She was brought up in an era where, it was perfectly people's rights, and all of her books encourage British people to go abroad and start up manufactories and import export businesses. So on the scale of all the people I've ever written about, she's by no means to as far to the right as most people. She certainly is much more a sympathetic character. She has genuine concern for people. She really respects these cultures into which she enters. But at the same time, I would say she is probably an imperialist. She's probably a colonialist. It's just part of who she is. It's a great question, actually, and it's not one that I'm generally asked about her. She is also very personally attractive, I think, in terms of, whenever she writes to Murray, she writes him these gorgeous letters that are all about, how are the children in the nursery, and how are and she remembers the names of the children. All of her friends that she writes to, she seems to remember the names of the children, and she's really concerned with people. And so I think that masks part of that colonialist um, belief or colonialist sense of entitlement in her material, because she is so concerned with people. She's so interested in them, and quite genuinely so. But I think that is still there as well, that she thinks it's perfectly fine for Britain to go and plant a flag anywhere that it feels like.
Being American who's now in Australia, yeah, colonialism comes up a fair bit. And
I come from Scotland, and we are arguably England's last colony. But Mariah came from a very conventional kind of Hanoverian Scottish clan who all worked with it. They're all good empire builders, um, and this very naval sort of family as well, which I think bespeaks, part of the way that she was brought up.
now, as we've mentioned, you've written a couple novels about a variety of people.
Mhm.
What was it about Mariah that captured your attention and said, "Yes, I need to write about her." And in fact, talking about her today, what is it about her that made you want to tell her story?
I think there was a lot of material in the archive. Very often, women's material, women's stuff isn't collected to quite an extraordinary degree. Even suffragette banners. I look always for suffragette banners, the banners that the suffragettes sewed themselves and walked under. A few years ago, I was in a museum. I was very excited. In the distance, I spotted a suffragette banner and I ran towards it eagerly and realized that it was the banner under which the male allies had marched. It was Men for the Suffrage, because most collectors, most curators are male and they have a sort of affinity with male material, but not so much with female material. And female stuff is very often looked on as not really being terribly important. And so it tends to be cast to the side. And so there's quite a lot of material for Mariah because she was published, because Murray kept everything. So there's a great deal of her stuff in the John Murray archive, which is currently in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. So I had easy access to that. And also in the Royal Geographical Society in London, there's quite a bit there that relates to her, and letters and so forth that are from her and to her. So there was that, certainly, that the material was there, that I could really get a good understanding of her. And also that there were images, because Augustus Colcott painted her more than once. And so I could see her as well. That was quite exciting. But also it was the era. So Mariah is in South America in the early 1820s, and one of the key exports in Brazil at this time is cacao, chocolate beans, coffee, and coffee. Coffee's actually slightly bigger at the time, but cacao is really important. And this is a time of huge change in the chocolate industry. Massive industrial espionage going on all over Europe, and Danish and Dutch farmers who are taking over. They have realized, in fact, that they can cultivate cacao beans in Africa. And so these guys are going into Africa and setting up cacao farms, which makes cacao much cheaper because you don't have to bring the beans right across the Atlantic. You can just bring them up north through the Canary Islands and up to Europe that way. And so it's a time of big change in the chocolate industry. And initially, in the sort of very early 1800s, chocolate is only a drink. It's a very luxurious drink. It's a very expensive drink. And then as the century sort of progresses, we come through this period in the 1820s where they latterly sort of figure out how to make chocolate bars, what they call eating chocolate. And this means that you can carry it with you. It makes it much more accessible. And also cocoa or chocolate can be Dutched, which means it can be made into cocoa powder. Um, and that means it's something that you can keep in the kitchen for a long time. You can add to milk, for example, and it becomes something that people feed to their servants, or that is much more accessible, perhaps to more ordinary people. And so that story is also interwoven as part of the story that I tell, because in the book, not in real life, but in the novel, I make Mariah's journey back to Britain the only ride she can get, in fact, because of the Brazilian War of Independence, which is raging around her, on a ship which happens to be smuggling cacao beans. And she sort of gets caught up with the captain on this ship, who's a fictional character, and and they both affect each other really quite profoundly. She inspires him to go straight, if you like, and he awakens in something in her, I think, which he hasn't had in her marriage. She really fancies him. She doesn't end up with him, I have to say, but she really fancies him, and this is quite an exciting little story as they cross the Atlantic. And so it was the idea that I could dive into this very rich and interesting time of change within the cacao industry, alongside, Mariah's own story and the kind of real archive material that was available for her, being quite rare actually for a woman. Um, that was important to me. And so I just thought, this is a great story. This is a little perfect little storm here of information, real information, against which I can set this story, and really interrogate what it was to be a lady, what it was to be a woman, a British woman, at this time, somebody who was educated and was doing something that was considered quite unusual, quite edgy, quite difficult in many ways. And what did you have to do in order to succeed.
I talk to a lot of nonfiction writers, which you are also a nonfiction writer, and we'll circle back to that. But with fiction, I'm always intrigued by what did you change and why? So you've mentioned, wanting to address that larger um, situation that was happening with the chocolate industry. But are there any other changes that you made that you'd like to tell us about, just from a, creative process standpoint? Because
Mm.
I'm a nonfiction girly in terms of my writing, so I'm not supposed to change anything. So I'm very curious about that creative decision making.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because quite often when I write non-fiction, in fact, the main book that I've written that is non-fiction, I've written a few. The whole point was that it was creative non-fiction, so it was kind of doing a job in non-fiction that only a novelist could perhaps approach. Because I know that people who work in academia and who write more conventional non-fiction do find that really difficult. I think it was bringing together a series of things that didn't really come together. Like she did go back to Britain in the early 1820s, but she didn't go on that ship and she didn't meet some of the people. I've made up the captain of the ship, I've made up a Danish farmer who he goes into business with latterly in order to set up one of these farms in the north of Africa. I've created the conversations that existed or must have existed around her not being able to speak at the Royal Society, because although we know that she wasn't allowed to do so, we don't know what conversations went on. It's quite often for me a matter of putting in a skeleton of what really happened and then playing around with that to bring that story alive. And I think there is a function really for fiction to do that, particularly with the stories of women when we perhaps don't always have all of the details. Um, the stories we are told in history very often, particularly in schools or in college and quite often on television too, are are very based on, dates and acts of parliament and facts, 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 facts. People don't live by facts, facts, facts. They live by what they ate for breakfast and that they saw an elephant for the first time and that they fell in love today. These are the things that people make real life decisions around, actually. And very often they're not taught in sort of conventional mainstream history, but they are very much part of where we come from culturally, socially, politically. And I consider it my job to round out and diversify our understanding of where we come from so that we better understand where we are. And really, until you understand where you are, you can't really decide where you want to go in an informed fashion. So for me, it's a really important job. And quite often you're at book festivals and you're there with, crime writers, and they're like, oh, you history writers, who cares about all of that? It is the stuff of every political, economic, social decision that we make. Where we come from is really important. And we need to understand more about it. And we need to understand that some of that story is missing and what might that have been. So for me, the social history, the personal histories are very important.
There's historical crime fiction as well, right? That's also a thing that overlaps with fantasy, with sci-fi and like the steampunk sense. It overlaps with crime, romance, obviously. Hello, Bridgerton. Love Bridgerton. But,
Mm.
it's like the idea that anybody's looking at, oh, my genre's better than yours. Like, it's historical. We have all the genres.
Yeah, we do. I mean, I wrote a 9 book historical crime series at one point, set in the 1950s, completely different era, but I was kind of fascinated for a while with the 1950s. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is this kind of wider view of where we come from, the stuff that's been edited out for lots of different reasons. And that includes queer history, women's history, and lots of sort of minority histories. Until we sort of come to really understand that we come from that. And I do stuff in schools. For example, I go into schools and quite often they get me to talk to the girls, but sometimes they let the boys in as well. And when they let the boys in, we go to question time at the end. And I've just talked to them all about female history and the amazing foremothers that they have and how they should be proud of that and how that's part of where they come from just as much as all these, men's names that they know. And this wee boy always at the front, there's always one. He puts up his hand and he says, oh, when we get to questions, and he always says, Miss, what's this got to do with me? And I always say, these are your grannies too. Male history is not for men and female history is not for women. We come from all of this. We come from history that isn't our own history, even. We come from other communities' histories, because there's always interaction. And so it's really important to have a broad understanding of our history so that we understand all the influences, that we don't think that we come from this one straight line, which is male and white and upper class and heteronormative and about the economy and about acts of parliament and about war. Because there's a lot more to us than those things.
It's interesting when you mentioned that, the boys don't necessarily see what this has to do with them. And this is not criticizing the boys, it's more criticizing the system that, they never question, well, why do the girls need to learn about all these men in history, or what I call choms, cis het
Mm.
abled white men?
Yeah, totally.
Because I just got tired of saying all of the words. But, it is very much that entrenched male as default bias that we see in so many things, both in a historical and a contemporary standpoint.
Mm.
So I understand that you're doing work to rectify that.
One of the things I'm involved in is a campaign in Edinburgh. There was a murder in 1721, a young woman who was the victim of domestic violence. Her husband tried to kill her for weeks and weeks, and he eventually succeeded, and he succeeded in what is now Hollywood Park behind Hollywood Palace. And he was caught, he was tried, he was hung, and the citizens of Edinburgh were so appalled by what happened to this woman, Margaret Hall, that they put up a cairn, a stone mound in the park. And it's a tumble down cairn now. It's been there for a long time. It has no notices, but it is known on maps as Mushet's Cairn. And that's his name. That's the murderer's name. Now, it wasn't put up to him. Initially, it was known as the cairn in memory of Margaret Hall. She was known as Ailey's Cairn. But over the 200 intervening years, it had changed. And literally, myself and my friend Andy Arthur, who is a very expert historian in Edinburgh, started this campaign and basically fought to get, they're going to put this summer an information board up and they're going to change the map, the name on the map. But we really had to stand up for her. And that's the patriarchy in action. The patriarchy just stinks, you know. You don't even realize it's there. You're inside this goldfish bowl. It's a continuum and it's going on today. You have to pick your fights. And Mariah did that. Mariah did that as well. She picked her fights. So she wasn't too worried about not being, included at the Royal Society because she was included at Murray's Salons and she got to speak to all these people who were members of the Royal Society through John Murray. She just found her path.
Would you like to tell us about your Where Are the Women guidebook?
In 2016, I think it was, Rebecca Solnit published in The New Yorker an article which renamed several metro stops in New York after women. All of these metro stops were named after men, and she renamed them, remapped it, and told the story of the city through the story of these women. And I, at the time, had been part of a group of writers who had written a set of short stories based in different locations around Scotland for Historic Environment Scotland, which is one of our big heritage agencies. And as a result of this book, I had been touring Scotland with a load of other writers, and we'd done events in lots of these different locations. And when I was there, I realized, there's really very little women's history, if any, uh, in any of these sites. And when I got back to Edinburgh, I had a go at my editor at Historic Environment Scotland and said, you really need to do something. And he had seen this article in the New Yorker, as had I. It was all over the internet. The New Yorker had fabulous sort of memes going about it and all the rest of it. And he said, I think I would like to commission that. And initially I thought he meant maybe a bus route in Edinburgh or, the tram in Glasgow or something, or the underground system in Glasgow. But he said, no, I want you to do the whole country. I want you to remap the whole country and just rename everything, rememorialize women's lives. And I was kind of breathless at the idea of this, but I wanted to do it. So I took what was really a very male approach because if you if a woman is offered a job, they always say, and she can do 50% of it, she thinks, I can't do 50% of it. If a man is offered a job and he can do 50% of it, he thinks, well, I'll figure the rest out. So I just said yes. And I went home and didn't sleep for about 3 nights. I was up looking at a map of Scotland. I bought a giant map that I put up on the wall in the study and trying to figure out how on earth I would do this. And it took several months. It did a huge amount of research and remapped Scotland according to women's history. And our women's history, really from the time of myths and legends, the time of the Cailleach, who is the Hag of Spring. The waking of the Cailleach in the Highlands is actually one of the oldest pagan rituals in Europe, and it happens to this day. Um, right up to well, the rules at Historic Environment Scotland is that everyone has to be dead. So right up to people who had died really fairly recently. And I think I had about 1,600 women in the book in the end. And it really radicalized me writing it because what I realized is we have been completely left out of our both our urban landscapes, our rural landscapes. And it just struck me as a child, walking around Edinburgh with my brothers. My brothers constantly saw streets that were named after men and large statues, to male achievements. And I had nothing like that to look at, and how difficult it was um, to imagine success when you don't see that in the built landscape around you. And so yeah, it was Where the Women became sort of quite a seminal book for me because it certainly radicalized me and made me extremely angry. It seems to make other readers extremely angry too. Quite often I do events and people came up and said, I was absolutely furious when I read your book. And I think that that is basically an achievement. And finding those stories, finding ways to memorialize women in the way that men are memorialized, not only women who had achieved great things, but women who had achieved things on a local level, a local midwife, somebody who was a tea lady at a football park. Men are memorialized at every level, and women are excluded. And the erasure of women's life, the erasure of women's history is extraordinary, and particularly in our capital, in Edinburgh. There are more statues currently to named animals in Edinburgh than there are to named women. And there is in central Edinburgh currently no statue erected to a woman in central Edinburgh, to a woman who isn't royal. There's two Victorias and a couple of Mary Queen of Scots, but there is no non-royal statue. There are a couple of monuments, including the cairn that I mentioned, and there is a kind of monument just off the back of Charlotte Square to Catherine Sinclair, who was a Victorian writer. Um, but really, there's so little. And I feel this is one of the most important things. It's almost as important as the stories we tell our children when we read to them, that they see around them that success is possible, and that their achievements will be honored and included is just so important.
Now, speaking of statues, my understanding is that there is one that's meant to be on the horizon, but there's some drama around that. So, could you tell us about the woman the statue is going to be of and the controversy and scandal around the statue?
So, yeah, Elsie Ingalls is an icon. She's a legend. She was a very early female medic. She's not one of the first intake of female medics at the University of Edinburgh, but she's, one of those first generation. And she studied to become a doctor, became a doctor, and she set up a women and children's hospital on the High Street in Edinburgh. The High Street in the early 20th century is effectively a slum. So she goes into the slums, she sets up this hospital that looks after the women of the parish, basically, and it's quite an achievement. And she quite often refuses to be paid. Doctors at this point, there's no National Health Service, and so there are small charges made for being in this hospital. But quite often, Elsie waives the charges and tells people who are trying to pay her, go and buy some pork chops instead. She's always trying to feed everybody up. And then when World War One broke out in 1914, Elsie marched up to the castle, which is at the top of Edinburgh in the Royal Mile, presents herself to the colonel in charge and says to him, I want to go and set up field hospitals. And he dismisses her completely. He says, Dear lady, please go home and sit still. Elsie thankfully does not sit still. The British government refused to fund her, but she goes to France and she gets some money and she sets up something called the Scottish Women's Hospitals, which ultimately sends over 20,000 medics, nurses, support staff, and doctors, female doctors, into the battlefields behind the lines, though, in World War One, and she saves countless lives In 1917, she's captured along with some other people in the organization when Serbia falls, and they eventually get released. They walk to Switzerland, these women, which is a very long way, come back to Scotland, and many of them actually go back into the field hospitals to help. They're really committed, and they make a genuine difference to how many people survive these terrible battles that are raging across Europe at this time. Dr. Ingalls dies in 1917. She has cancer, and there's money put aside at this point for a memorial, but it's not really very clear what happens. I suspect it becomes that money eventually gets rolled into what became the Elsie Ingalls Maternity Hospital out at the back of the High Street on Hollywood Park. It's where I was born. Many people were born in the Elsie Ingalls Memorial Hospital, and it closed in the 1980s. And there has been since then no real memorial to Elsie Ingalls until a blue plaque was put up on the high street on the site of where she had opened her women's and children's hospital. Um, so about a few years ago, a campaign was started, a community-based campaign to raise funds to put up a statue to Elsie Ingalls. And this is a really important statue in our capital city here. Dr. Ingalls is an iconic figure, and she would be the first statue to a non-royal named woman in Edinburgh, a woman who can be celebrated for her own achievements, which were legendary, which were huge and had a huge impact on women's lives in the city, on the way that the way that women were treated medically, because she was very good at listening to women and understanding that their lives were perhaps complicated. She dealt quite often with victims of domestic violence, for example, who would come to the hospital for help, but also nationally and globally had an impact because she set up the Scottish Women's Hospitals. And money started to be raised, and there was materials being made to go into schools so that children in Edinburgh schools and across Scotland would be taught more about Elsie Ingalls' achievements. So there was really quite a bit of a community campaign going on, and an open process was started for submissions to what this monument should be, what kind of statue should it be, what would fit best on this site. And it was glorious because, it's very difficult if you're a woman to get an artist to be commissioned to do something like that. This is an iconic site, an iconic figure, and the idea was it was a really transparent process. And many people seemed to be in the process of being about to apply to put forward their ideas. And suddenly, out of the blue, the trustees cancelled it. And it turned out they had had an offer from a guy called Alexander Stoddart, who is the king's, or was at the time the queen's own sculptor in Scotland. And Mr. Stoddart, because of his appointment, is not allowed to go into competitions. So he couldn't be in competitions, but he said, I'll do it. I'll do this statue. Now, he's done various other statues all around Edinburgh, including David Hume, which is another statue on the High Street. And there's also a statue of his on George Street, which is another of our main streets. Another man, a physicist. Um, there was kind of an outcry at the time, and the trustees were really shocked. They said, "Oh, but he's this fantastic guy is going to come in and do the statue," and everyone was like, "But Elsie would have hated that. That is exactly what Elsie wasn't about. She fought the patriarchy her whole life. This should be an open process project. We've all given time. Loads of people have given time and energy, and I had done a free event for them, fundraising event for them, and lots of people had contributed to the statue. They'd raised about £50,000. It was a really popular campaign, and people were excited, and it just seemed like the wrong decision. And the trustees just panicked, and they sort of seemed to disappear. And then a few weeks ago, they announced they had a new set of trustees. They had raised something along the lines of £300,000 without needing to go to the public, and the Stoddart statue was going to go ahead. And so there's been a general outcry, and the planning permission portal at the Edinburgh City Council has been inundated with people saying that this isn't really what we want. The statue that Stoddart has proposed is basically a 3D version of a sort of middle-aged Elsie in a uniform on a plinth. It just feels that it excludes and doesn't honour women's experience within the city, or her contribution to women's experience within the city. It focuses very much on the war, which was a great part of her achievement as well, of course. Um, It's extremely traditional. And having heard some of the, some people have come forward, some sculptors have come forward, particularly female sculptors, and talked about what they would have done. It just sounds more inclusive, some of the proposals, but they didn't even get to make their proposals. Mr. Stoddart came in and kind of scooped up all this cash and said he was going to do it. So it has been a big controversy. It was on the news last night over here. There's been articles in most of the major national papers, including the London papers. The Guardian did an article, and the Observer did an article the other day as well, about this process and about the way that it's been handled. And it's such an important one because, everyone of my age, certainly who was born in Edinburgh at the same kind of time as me, feels a strong connection to Elsie because we were born in the Elsie Ingalls Memorial Hospital. And so she is a kind of character who's perhaps better known and really connected in people's minds with the care of women and children, which the statue doesn't really reflect.
I do find that a lot of times when we do actually get something physical to honor women, a lot of times it's a group of men giving the project to a male artist. And so my understanding is that Stoddard is Scottish, at least, but also as the formerly Queen's, now King's, like official sculptor, he's also kind of representative of the monarchy, which I would assume is fairly controversial, because I would guess that Elsie, unlike Mariah, was not an imperialist. And I know there's a lot of strong feelings in Scotland about the monarchy and being part of the what remains of the British Empire.
Mm.
So I'm curious if that was part of this, not just that, we finally are getting this is the first statue of a woman and you gave it to a man.
Mm.
Not just
Yeah,
that.
the
Without
question.
competition, I would imagine that was also like you didn't even let anyone else compete for this.
Totally. And they were in the middle of a competition. They had announced a competition, people were preparing entries, and then they suddenly said, "Oh, Mr. Stoddart has arrived. We'll just give it to him. Aren't you all delighted? Because how fantastic." And everyone was like, "No." Even my mother, who was really old-fashioned, my mother's dead now, but this is because this is a couple of years ago. But even my mother, who's tremendously traditional, said to me, "That is definitely not fair," she said. So I think there was a real sense of, because she had a connection. She had three children in that hospital that was named after Elsie before it closed, but both my brothers were born there as well. Was Elsie an imperialist? I mean, there are pictures of her in the hospitals with British flags, certainly with Union Jacks. It's hard to tell. I think she was fairly conformist to a degree because she was a suffragist. She was not a suffragette. She was possibly because she was a doctor and she had taken the Hippocratic Oath and therefore she couldn't sort of harm anybody. And the suffragettes at the time, certainly in the run up to 1914, were sort of blowing up post boxes and setting houses alight. They burnt Robert Burns's house to the ground, I think. Um, so certainly there was a certain amount of frantic activity, and she was a suffragist. She didn't support that. She wanted the suffrage, but she wanted to campaign without any kind of radical violence or anything like of that nature. Um, I would say her contribution to the suffrage was that she set up the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and at the end of the war in 1919, we did get the vote for women over 35, like Elsie, who were kind of middle class, and that was in recognition of the work that women had done in part during the war, and she certainly contributed to that. But her views on the empire, I wouldn't like to say she wasn't an empiricist or a colonialist. She might well have been. I'm not sure. It was certainly of her era. Although at that turn of the century time, there was a sort of great rise in almost Jacobitism, the Stuarts against the Hanoverian monarchy. And there was huge public meetings going on about potentially what they called Home Rule in Scotland, which we would now think of as independence, as the independence movement. And I have no clue really where she stood on that, to be honest.
Of course, I don't expect you to know every single thing about her. I do find it interesting that regardless of what her actual opinions may have been, she needed support. And so there is a strong incentive for her to not do or say anything too controversial because she's got this whole organization that she's running.
Mm.
It's very important, and being a radical could have endangered her primary work.
Yeah, I
So
think that's true. I think that's probably true. I mean, it is a radical act in the early 20th century to decide as a woman that you want to study medicine, you want to be a doctor. That of itself is extraordinary, is something that's relatively new. The first medical students in Edinburgh are sort of late 19th century, but it's still quite a decisive thing to do. She never marries. There is probably quite a strong case that she was a lesbian. But we don't really know that for sure either, but it's perfectly possible. So she had plenty of things that she was probably quite radical about, but in a very quiet way, I would say.
the quiet radical, a new
Yeah.
biography. And actually, I've got other episodes about Mary Church Terrell and Patricia Robinson, and it's basically looking at women's militancy, like this nurturing militancy, and like what actually makes someone radical and militant. It's not necessarily like the guy shouting in the square. It could
Mhm.
be like the woman going into people's homes and like telling women, you don't have to stay with an abuser. You don't have to have kids if you don't want to have kids.
It's really interesting in relation to Elsie because there's certainly, I haven't studied Elsie extensively, but I've been to lots of lectures and talks and know other people who have. And certainly part of her medical notes, she was really dealing day to day with women who were facing domestic violence and supporting them through that and helping them with their injuries and trying to help them basically in any way that she could. It's not the first woman and baby hospital in Edinburgh. The original woman and baby hospital was set up by a medic called Sophia Jex Blake, who was one of the first intake of the at the University of Edinburgh in the medical school, one of the Edinburgh Seven, who were the seven first women in the UK who studied medicine.
Where's the Edinburgh 7 statue? Because
Yeah, there isn't an Edinburgh Seven statue. I mean, there are some Sophia Jex Blake plaques, and there is an Edinburgh Seven painting in the Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh. So and the university have done some work around commemorating Sophia Jex Blake and the rest of the Edinburgh Seven. So there's bits and pieces that have been done, but there isn't a statue.
well, I do wonder if it comes back to that sort of respectability aspect that we've been talking about is, Elsie was, taking care of people. She went to war, she did these things that were very nurturing and, as you said, radical for the time, but still in the context of taking care of women and children,
Mm,
is very respectable. I would say even in that age, like perhaps not, she definitely pushed the boundaries, but that
mm.
context of Sophia and the other six were there to challenge the patriarchy. They were there pushing their way in. They were having to fight their way through a riot to get to an exam.
Elsie didn't have to do that. These are two separate, like this is decades apart.
No, no, I know.
Um,
I'm just saying that like I'm just curious about sort of the connotations of when we're talking about being
mm,
controversial, being radical. And I totally want a statue of Elsie. This is in no way meant to diminish Elsie,
mm.
but I find it curious that nobody's talking about a statue for the Edinburgh Seven as far as I know.
Seven.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're all talking. It's which one comes first. You know, everyone is a fight. But, you know, getting a plaque on a cairn has taken over 2 years. And the cairn's there. And that has been really dedicated 2 years of like getting in touch with people, enrolling people in various institutions to come on board. Finally finding people who were prepared to stand up for it within the structures, within the organizations, and then supporting them, and finding politicians who were prepared to stand up for it.
That's Margaret Hull, the woman whose husband killed her
Yeah,
and
yeah.
couldn't even get her own cairn named for her.
It was originally. It's you know, people come in, that's what the patriarchy does. It just subsumes. It just subsumes. And you see this right the way through. You see this in terms of legacy. If you are non-conformist at all, it will be knocked out of your legacy, like Jane Austen. So Jane Austen is a non-conformist writer. Jane Austen in Mansfield Park names all the baddies after the most famous slave owners in Britain. And there is an outcry when this happens. right? And people don't like this book. People don't like Mansfield Park originally because of this. It's as obvious as if you named like the murderer in your crime book Boris Johnson, right? It's as obvious as that in the time, but not to us now because this history is largely lost. Like these names are not as famous. They're not day-to-day household names now. And so Jane Austen for people now is about, a pretty frock and a cup of tea and maybe a scone, and isn't it all lovely? And, Colin Firth coming out of a lake in a wet shirt looks fantastic. It isn't about that anymore, but Jane Austen stood up for what she believed in to some degree and was punished for that in her books, in terms of book sales, in terms of review coverage and so forth. So what the patriarchy will do is take it away if it can. It'll take away your voice if it can, whatever that voice is. A cairn named for a woman who is murdered, or the reputation or the genuine reputation of a female writer, it just scoops it out, just takes it away. And in terms of change makers in the creative community, if that's something that we're talking about, which I suppose we kind of are, and Mariah Graham was a change maker within the creative community, the distinction there is much more important, not whether they are creative or non-creative, but whether they are conformist or non-conformist, and to what degree they aren't conformist or non-conformist, and how they represent that. And that to me is one of the really interesting things in the archive when you find these little stories of people digging their heels in or saying something that's not acceptable at the time, bringing that out, talking about those things is really important because it's ammunition for our young women today.
We've talked about books, we've talked about plaques and statues, but you also did a, so, shall we say, more unusual memorialization of historical women. Can you tell us about Reek?
Yeah, Reek doesn't exist anymore. Reek was a project that started with my daughter Molly. We created perfume. The first perfume we created was in memory of the Jacobite women, the women who took part in the Jacobite uprisings, not in the battlefield, but in their support for the Jacobite cause. And they're sort of Scotland's greatest rebels, and they were demeaned horribly by the Hanoverian press. The Hanoverians won, so they got to tell the story. And famously, the Hanoverian press called them those damn rebel bitches. So we created a perfume, hand mixed, hand poured perfume that was made of the smell of their lives, really. The smell of oranges, blood oranges, some of the herbs and flowers that were used in childbearing at the time, hazelnuts, which were a big part of the Highland diet in the era. And we called the perfume Damn Rebel Bitches. And we initially made 100 bottles, which went on sale in a pop-up that we organised during the Edinburgh Festival, the arts festival in the summer in Edinburgh in August. And we were told by various people, you won't sell 100 bottles of this. It's £100 a bottle. It's quite expensive. But luckily, there were a lot of Damn Rebel Bitches at the festival. And we did. We sold out. And we went on to produce more of this, and we had this sort of real interest that just came out of nowhere. We were in French Vogue, we were in Harper's and Bazaar, we were in like loads of magazines picked up on this idea that you could memorialize the spirit of where you came from. It didn't have to be a permanent thing. You could do it with a smell. You could just do it with the smell of perfume. So then we made Damn Rebel Witches, because in Scotland we had the worst witch trials per capita in Europe. And so we had really horrific witch trials. There's actually an amazing campaign that's been started by Claire Mitchell and Zoe Ventadozzi to create a national memorial for the witches, the accused witches of Scotland, and also obtain a pardon for these women who were killed, because it is mostly women. It's 86% of the witch trials in Scotland targeted women. Anyway, we created Damn Rebel Witches, and we were about to create Pirate Queens to memorialize some very amazing pirates, including Gráinne O'Malley, the great Irish pirate queen, when Brexit happened. And we had been actually selling quite a lot. We've been making it and bottling it in the garage at the back of our house. Our whole street smelled amazing. Um, and we had loads of customers, and about a third of our customers were coming from Northern Europe, and we realized we just weren't going to be able to ship easily to Northern Europe anymore. And we decided, well, it was an art project. We were making a statement. We've done it for 3 years. It took up every day of my life for 3 years. We're gonna just decide not to do that anymore. And so we had a big sale and we closed it down. And some of the materials were collected by the National Museum of Scotland and also by the Glasgow Women's Library, which are two of our major collecting institutions in Scotland. And so I feel very good that it's kind of in the system, it's in the curation system. And I still get people coming up to me at events sometimes. They say, "Oh, I've just got a little spritz left in my bottle, smell it." And I can smell they've got the damn rebel bitches on. So it's kind of lovely, actually. It was a great thing to do, and it really inspired me because I laterally went on to write a novel called The Fair Botanist, which won Scottish Book of the Year in 2022. And one of the main characters, Belle Brodie, in that book, makes perfume.
So it seems like whatever people want to do, whether that's, how creative it may be, or if they're technically inclined, there's plenty of digital options. There's local versus national and international. I just feel like there's so much women's history out there, and there are so many ways to share it that if anyone feels so inclined to pursue any project, if that's making perfume or pushing for a plaque or a statue or writing a book, um, go do it.
That is exactly my attitude, actually. I think this is how change is made. It's by people deciding to do something. And all of these things are actually difficult to do. So if one person decides to do it and another person decides to do another thing and another person decides to do another thing, then if they're successful, we have three things. And that's three more things than we have at the moment. Um, and so it is just a case of building. It's just building that, and particularly building within our urban environment. That's really important, actually. So statues. I have various friends who are, much more famous, much more successful creatives than me. And when I wrote Where Are the Women, several of them said to me, "So how do I do it? How do I get remembered?" And I'm like, endow a library, like gift a park, give a hospital wing with your name on it. That is the only way that you get to do it. And I often tell the story of the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So Good Friday Agreement's the peace agreement that sort of ended the Troubles. And the 20th anniversary, they have Radio 4 here, BBC Radio 4, and they have all the big politicians on, Tony Blair's on, Alistair Campbell's on, all these people that were involved in it. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, somebody phones in and says, "What about Mo Mowlam?" And Mo Mowlam is the woman, she was a minister, who brokered the agreement. And these guys hadn't mentioned her. Nobody had mentioned her. She had been dead, she had died of cancer, and she was just almost immediately completely cut out of the story. And the minute this was said, all of the people in the studio went, "Oh, yeah, Mo Mowlam. Oh, she was amazing." And they started to talk about Mo Mowlam, but it wasn't something that was included from the beginning. It was the first thing that should have been said, and it wasn't. Um, and that to me is, that's what happens. That's the patriarchy. Patriarchy stinks. And we need to challenge that. We need to remember to phone into the radio program and say, "What about Momolan?" We need to we need to sign the petition for the statue. We need to try and put up a plaque. And if you're very privileged, you need to, buy a park and give it to the city in your name or do whatever you need to do because we need these stories. All of us need these stories.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well behaved women rarely make history.